Hey everybody, glad to be back with you this week. I don't know if you can believe it or not, but we are halfway through men's Bible study as of this lesson, and so thank you for your perseverance and the work that you've already been putting in. If I can encourage you to do one thing, it'd be to press on. And if you're somebody who maybe you've fallen behind or you've missed a week, I'd encourage you, don't worry about catching up on what you've missed. Just look forward to what's coming. Because if you start to try to worry about catching up and doing the work that's before you, probably not going to be able to get through all of it. So just look forward, keep going with us. I promise it's going to be worth your time. I'm excited for today, not only because I enjoy doing this with you, but because this week we get to go through an entire chapter and we don't really have to worry about looking backwards to think about context or think about historical setting. We can just really look at the text of Ruth chapter 2. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and do that. If we're remembering where we are in the story, we've just left off of chapter 1 where things have been very dark for our characters, for Naomi and Ruth. But there's a glimmer of hope at the end of chapter 1. There's this introduction that they are brought back to the story, to our setting at the beginning of the harvest season. And thematically, given the fact that we've been seeing that this story is linked to the story of the patriarchs, that there is an expectation that God is going to do something special here, we are wondering, what will this harvest bring for our characters? And so as readers of this story, I think it's helpful if we just remember what we should be thinking as people who are hearing the story, because when we chop the story up into these discrete little pieces, like we're doing, and study one chapter at a time or one section of verses at a time, we can kind of lose track of the fact that this is one story, one narrative, and the original audience probably would have heard this in a single sitting. So let's think about where our minds would be as the audience if we were heading into chapter 2. We probably would be thinking about, why did Ruth leave the comfortable situation, or at least more comfortable situation, that she had in Moab? And what awaits her as she entrusts herself to Naomi and her household and the provision and care of Yahweh and his people, Israel? And probably also thinking, how is Ruth going to be received by the town? How are the people going to see her as she is entering Bethlehem, as she's integrated into the life of Bethlehem? And the audience is probably also thinking of their own biases. Remember, this is written not at the time of the days of the judges. So they're probably thinking about, what do I think about a Moabite and the fact that this is a central character who is being upheld as righteous? And lastly, they're probably thinking, what hope is there for these women? What provision will allow for them to have success, to have food, to be able to make an existence in the land? How will our story find a resolution? So with those things on our mind, we look at the text. It begins, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." And then what we ought to notice here is this is one of those moments where the narrator is addressing us as the audience directly. And I call that out because the story's details can get a little bit confusing as we go, because Boaz is going to be brought up multiple times, and we need to recognize this line here is being addressed to us as the audience directly, but our main characters, Ruth and Naomi, don't yet know what we know. So we have an expectation being set up from the narrator. He's telling us, hey, look out for what's going to come. What he's identifying for us is, as we leave off this hope of they've come at the beginning of harvest, immediately on the heels of the end of chapter 1, chapter 2 tells us there's a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech. And so this is the key for us of this is how we see the beginning of harvest being able to play out in favor for Ruth and Naomi. And what we see is when we're describing a worthy man for these people would have been somebody who lived out, who characterized, who is marked by living under God's law. He's a righteous man. And this stands in stark contrast to the background that's been painted for us so far in our understanding of the book of Judges. So by itself, a worthy man gives us a bit of hope. And then we see that this worthy man is a relative. And so what's the big deal with being a relative? Well, we need to think a little bit about the context of the Jewish law. And so we're not going to dig into all the details today, but you looked up a couple passages in your workbook this week that related to some concepts from both Leviticus and Deuteronomy that are being referenced here in passing by identifying that this is a near relative or a kinsman of Naomi. Within the Jewish system, we talked previously about how nation states didn't really exist in the same capacity during this era And so what they had was they had family structures that provided for one another. And so these family structures in Israel, there were really two ways in which God's law specifically prescribed for caring for those who were disenfranchised through the death of a family member, and particularly the death of a husband, since he would have been the primary provider in the midst of this culture. And so those two things were levirate marriage and the right of redemption. Levirate marriage and the right of redemption. And we're actually going to look at those a little bit more in detail later in the story, but the reason the narrator is bringing up the fact that this is somebody of the clan of Elimelech, they are letting us know this person sits closely enough in relation to Naomi that one of these two traditions may be true for him, or one of these two legal precedents of levirate marriage or the right of redemption, the kinsman redeemer, this may be the way in which this person acts to bless Naomi and Ruth. And we don't yet know how this will play out, but that's the expectation, the backdrop the narrator is setting for us by giving us this hint of, hey, this guy who's about to come, his name is Boaz, he is tied into the family. And so we as careful readers of the text now have our eyes opened. Either there's going to be a levirate marriage connection here. Levirate marriage is the idea that if a husband and wife, if the husband dies, the wife is left childless, a family member of the husband is obligated to continue that husband's line. The language that's used is he propagates the name of the dead. He ensures that the dead husband's line carries on beyond the husband. So that could be a source of hope for us. Or this kinsman redeemer, this right of redemption, is somebody who would purchase people out of slavery, out of bondage, out of debt, out of the abundance of their own possessions if they had the ability to do so. And all of this that we've just said about this clan structure, this kinsman relationship, it probably wouldn't mean very much to us if it were not for the fact that Boaz is described as a worthy man. So it's these two things held together. He's worthy, he lives under God's law, and he's, in a sense, obligated. He's a family member. So because we have both pieces, we're now waiting to see what's going to happen here. So the text goes on, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, so we're away from the narrator's commentary, we're back into the action of the story. She said, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she, Naomi, said to her, Ruth, go, my daughter." So the first thing I want to call out here is Ruth is referred to as Ruth the Moabite by the narrator. And this isn't just a casual thing or an accident. The narrator is identifying Ruth as a Moabite for two primary reasons. One, the narrator wants us to understand that even though Ruth is starting to become the central figure, the heroine of our story, probably for the people who are interacting with her, very much they still view her as a Moabite. It is, in their mind, her primary identifier. So part of this is just giving us a fuller picture of what's going on in the story. But the narrator also identifies Ruth as the Moabite because the narrator wants us to wrestle with this tension of this Moabite woman. She is taking advantage of God's law, or rather she is depending upon God's law. She's acting righteously. She's seeking to provide food for herself and for Naomi. She is an upstanding woman. And so probably there's a bit of shock on the part of the original hearers of this because they may have had a negative perception of a Moabite. So by calling out Ruth the Moabite is doing these positive things, she's waiting on Yahweh's provision, availing herself of the law, this is going to set this contrast off in the minds of the readers. And what she says is that she's going to find a field of someone who will have mercy on her, in whose sight she will find favor. One thing to call out here is she says, the field. And so when we're first reading this, we might wonder, does she have a specific field in mind? Not really. She's using a general expression to say she's going to go find a field to be working in. And when she says, after him in whose sight I find favor, likewise, we can wonder, does she have a specific him in mind? No, they're basically saying, we know that in order for me, Ruth, to be blessed by gleaning, by having gleaner's rights, I'm going to need a landowner who's willing to give me those rights, who isn't going to chase me off. And so that's the expectation Ruth is setting. She says her stated goal is to glean. And again, in your workbook this week, you worked through what gleaning was. I'm sure you talked about it in your small groups as well. We see a few spots in Leviticus 19 and 23 and in Deuteronomy 24 where instructions are given for gleaning, as well as the rationale for why those are given. But gleaning is a really subsistence level farming. It is following after reapers, after the primary collectors of a harvest, so that they can take the little pieces that were missed. So gleaning is God's way of ensuring. He gives instructions like don't harvest all the way up to the edge of your field, don't go to the corners, leave it for the orphan, the foreigner, the alien, the widow. God very specifically instructs his people that they are to ensure everyone in the land is able to feed themselves through its produce, even the people who don't own the land. God's heart is for the disenfranchised, and he builds this into the very fabric of Israelite society. And this is really significant for us to recognize that one reason that Ruth is inclining herself towards Israel, that she's cast herself upon the mercy of Yahweh, is because she sees in his law that God is a God who cares about the unfortunate. He cares about those who do not possess something. And further, this tells us something about God's relationship with his chosen people, Israel. We've talked a few times about how Israel is meant to be a contrast community, that by the way they live in a way that's different than all the nations that surround them, the other nations would recognize this God is different. And obviously that's happened with Ruth. She's seen that Yahweh is a different God than the gods that she formerly served in Moab. Whenever we see that God is different, what we mean practically in this is that God is instructing his people to care for those because ultimately the land belongs to God. Anyone in Israel who owns the land, they own it on tenure, meaning they're really just leasing it from the Heavenly Father who owns all of it. And God, through his people Israel, he's feeding everyone in the community. And so we need to understand God ultimately is the owner of the land if it's rightly understood. And Ruth is looking for the kind of man who understands this man understands God owns this land, which means that my job is not just to feed myself, but to feed anyone who may be in need. And so that's why she's saying somebody who will show favor towards her. We see that gleaning also, it has this double effect of God is providing, but he's providing by giving people a job. So it's not just that Ruth is going to go collect some extra grain that's being dropped off somewhere, but she's being invited into working to collect this grain, which is interesting because work is just part of who we are as image bearers. Being people who bear the image of God means that we bring order out of chaos. We work, we labor, we reap the fruit of our labor, our toil. And so Ruth is being invited then to participate in what it means to be human, which is a beautiful thing. And so we see the scene closes with Naomi dismissing Ruth, saying, "Go, my daughter." And I think it's just important that we continue to dwell on the fact that Naomi uses familial language, warm language towards Ruth. There's a really strong bond between these two. So the text continues. It says, "So she, Ruth, set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan Elimelech." So here we've got it, some good old-fashioned Hebrew repetition, right? We're seeing that the story is kind of playing out. We're hearing echoes of it. It's driving things home to us. Really what it ought to be building in us as careful readers is a sense of expectation. So narrator gave us a hint at the very beginning. Hey, the clan of Elimelech, somebody who is close to our family, is going to be important in our story. And now we see this is the field she happens to come to. And we see that the text presents this as circumstance because Ruth has not premeditated that she will come to Boaz's field. Yet we know behind the scenes that even though Yahweh, God, has not been mentioned as arranging these things, that in a biblical narrative, God is always our main character, right? And so we know that God is arranging that Ruth would come to the field of Boaz because he longs to provide for her. And we see that one of your themes that we're trying to call out is God's blessing in obedience and faithfulness. We're going to see God's blessing to Ruth, to Naomi, through his the obedience and faithfulness he will show in Boaz here in just a moment. So the text continues, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest.'" So we see with this, and behold, we shift again from narrator commentary where he's summarizing, so Ruth went and gleaned, and then we see the narrative advance again. We see that Boaz is introduced as coming from Bethlehem. There's really not much significant here. Bethlehem would have been kind of the center of the city's life, so to come from the city would have been a normal activity. Boaz may have had a residence in the city, or he may just have been doing business there. And we'll see later that Bethlehem as the city serves as a central function for us when we get to chapter 4. But we see this brief exchange between Boaz and his reapers. And it's very likely that this is a customary exchange where they're kind of exchanging pleasantry and they are wishing blessing upon one another. But we ought to ask the question, why would the narrator think to include this for us? Because the narrator is certainly not obligated to tell us something as simple as kind of a perfunctory greeting between these two parties. So why? Well, what the narrator's trying to do is he's trying to show that Boaz has a friendly relationship between him and his workers, that they view him as a worthy man. He's giving us a little snapshot into, hey, I told you this was a worthy man beforehand. This is how we see it playing out in real life. And we see too that Boaz, he is not somebody who views his laborers just as a means of production, because he's entering in with them. He's having a conversation, and almost immediately he turns to his foreman, to the young man in charge of the reapers, and he asks the question, hey, who's this woman? And so he knows that this is not the same crew that normally is working in the fields. Tell me about this. He's somebody who is interested in the goings-on of his business, and he sees these workers as people, as image bearers. And so we move from this little exchange into the foreman's dialogue. And this is a little bit odd, because if we're being careful readers of the story, at first blush it can seem like we've got 3 layers of repetition here. Very beginning, Ruth says, I'm going to go glean. Then the narrator says, so Ruth went to glean. Then we have the foreman giving a report of gleaning. But if we're careful in our reading, we actually see that the Ruth's version of the truth and the narrator's version of the truth differs from what this foreman is going to say about Ruth's activity in her gleaning. And so what we see is there's a discrepancy in verbs here. Ruth and the narrator say that she is going to glean, while the foreman says that she is gathering. And this may seem small to us, but if we understand a little bit of the Hebrew of what's going on here, so gleaning has more of a precise or delicate connotation to it. To glean, because of the nature of what it is, the reapers have already passed through to harvest, so there's not a lot remaining. To glean is to pick individual pieces from remaining stalks. Versus to gather is to heap something up. Another place where this verb gather is used is when the Lord sent quail to the people in the wilderness and they were hungry for meat, and so they were gathering it up in their greed. And so gather has a negative connotation versus glean has a positive connotation. And similarly, when we're thinking about this, we see this discrepancy between following after the reapers, which is what Ruth and the narrator say that she's doing, that she's advancing behind them, versus going through the sheaves. And so sheaves are the collected bundles of grain. They would group together, they would be ready for transport. And so this is like the final product. And gleaners were instructed to glean among the stalks of grain, not among the final product that was packaged for shipment. And so we have to ask, well, what's going on here? And there's a few things that could be going on. Either Ruth began by gleaning, and then by the time we meet her later in the day, she's now gathering through the sheaves. And maybe that's because she wasn't getting enough gleaning, or maybe that's because she is a foreigner and so she doesn't understand local customs. So that's one possibility of what's going on. Or there's a distinction, a difference, a discrepancy between these two stories. And so what we see, and we need to remember when we see two characters being held up side by side, we're seeing the normal way of acting and the exceptional way of acting, the average way and the hesed way, the steadfast love way. And so we don't actually get to see Ruth's actions in the field. The narrator makes a conscious choice instead to filter her actions through the eyes of the foreman. And what happens in this interaction is Boaz says, hey, who is this? And the foreman, instead of just answering the question he was asked, this is Ruth, he goes on kind of a little soapbox speech, and he says, this is that Moabite. from the country of Moab, and she's been out here gathering. Really what he's doing is he's giving his interpretation of Ruth's motives. And this can be lost on us because he uses this phrase of, she said, please may I gather. And so when we read that, we think, okay, well, Ruth said, can I gather? And so that's what happened. But the phrase here, she said, is actually a Hebrew device that is him reading into her inner monologue. He's trying to guess or guessing at her motivation and her action. And so the foreman is over here viewing her negatively. And we can read that by seeing that, once again, his account differs from the account of the narrator and Ruth. And because he refers to her kind of in a scornful way. He calls her the Moabite, that woman from Moab. It's not a positive representation of this woman. And so we see here that there is a problem that Ruth is facing in regards to her gleaning. And this is really begging the question for us in our story of how is Boaz going to respond to the foreman's activity, which is really probably the typical or expected pattern of an Israelite viewing a Moabite, saying, okay, of course, there's that Moabite stealing from us when she shouldn't be. And this also ought to make us pause and ask a question of Ruth of, why has she put herself in this situation? And I think this is a good opportunity for us to remember back in the story, she left a field in Moab that was full of food. She did not need to come to Israel to take the bottom rung of society as a gleaner, let alone the bottom rung of society where she would be viewed as an outsider and her motivations would be suspect from the people that were supervising her work. And really, this tells us she must be captivated by God. She's captivated by the law, and she's captivated by there being a God who would love the poor, love the foreigner, love the alien so much that he would write into his very law provision for them to be fed. And so Ruth has really put herself in a vulnerable position here. And so we are now primed to think, okay, if this was the expected response, we see kind of a racist attitude from the foreman. We're wondering, how will Boaz react in the midst of this? And so the text goes on. It says, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. And so here's Boaz's initial response. He gives Ruth freedom to glean, right? He says, avail yourself of the law. You are welcome to glean here. And he's paternal and kind. He addresses her as my daughter. He ensures that she knows, hey, there are people you can stick close by, my young women, and the men will ensure that you have water drawn for you. In other words, he's saying you will be protected here and you can have a steady employment here. It's interesting here if we think about the language that Boaz uses in terms of clinging to the women or keep close to my young women. This is the same verb that was used earlier when Ruth clung to Naomi while Orpah departed. And so in that picture, we have this idea of Orpah leaves, but Ruth clings to Naomi in her care. And Boaz, without knowing it, invokes the exact same word. Our narrator knows it, though. And so this is suggesting to us that there may be a progression, just as Ruth clung to Naomi, perhaps she's now going to be clinging to Boaz and his household. And so we're wondering, especially in light of the detail that was revealed at the beginning of the chapter, that he is a relative and a worthy man, how might he be one that she would cling to? So faced with tribalism and the choice of thinking of the Moabite as less than, Boaz chooses the road of kindness. And Ruth, she responds in this way. She says, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And at this point, it may be helpful just to stop and think, Ruth, she knows that she is viewed as a foreigner, right? She probably felt the foreman's stares on her as she was working throughout the morning. And so for somebody to show such kindness in the midst of probably an era of great hostility between Israel and Moab, in the midst of their many conflicts with each other, is shocking to her. The text continues, but Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. So there's a lot that happens in this little exchange. This is really our key text for understanding who Boaz is and Ruth's acceptance into Israelite society. So let's take a second to understand this. First, again, we see Boaz's character clearly on display. The worthy man, he is saying that he knows who she is. Her reputation has preceded her. He says, your story has already reached me. This gives us an indication that Boaz cares about his community. He's in the know on what's going on in the town, and he is looking for a way to bless this young woman who has risked a great deal in order to follow after Israel's God. Really, in a practical sense, it's almost like Boaz is a CEO directly offering a position to somebody who's outside begging on the corner. She has a job offer directly from him. And Boaz, as he gives kind of this speech praising Ruth, he gives a couple of accolades to her where he says, I know how you left your father and mother. Again, this is language that really mirrors Genesis 2, where marriage as an institution is prescribed, where one leaves his father and mother and clings to or cleaves to his wife. And Boaz is invoking the same language and saying, I've heard how you left your home and you came here. Again, it's building in us this anticipation of, will this culminate in a marriage? And the key to Boaz's response, he says, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So there are those who judge Ruth because she is a Moabite. But what we see from Boaz is he is not concerned with ethnicity. He's concerned instead with the fact that she chooses to seek after, to worship Yahweh, to honor Naomi, to work in the midst of Israel, even though she has really lessened her position in society in order to do so. And he believes that those who are worshipers of God will ultimately be rewarded. Because she has put her trust in God's provision, he is waiting, he's praying out loud, may the Lord repay you, because he knows that God is a God who will shower graciously, plentifully on those who trust in him. And Boaz says his wish is that God would repay her, yet Boaz is the one who is acting. So as Boaz prays, may Yahweh bless you. May the Lord provide for you, because I've heard of what you've done, that you forsook your community and you've covenanted yourself to Naomi and her household because you love the God of Israel. Because of that, I'm going to act to ensure that God's provision is being carried out in your life. So he's giving us the why. Why would he give gleaner's rights to a foreigner? Well, because you actually are a member now of the household of Israel. And so what I want us to see here, this whole idea can feel a little bit odd to us. We are rightly taught that salvation is ours by grace, meaning it is unmerited favor. It's something that we did not earn. It's a gift that is given. But Boaz's language, he literally says, the Lord repay you for what you have done. To repay is not to give a gift. And so this can leave us asking a question of, wait, so is Ruth earning salvation? Is she earning her place into Israel? And I think it's a good question. It's a tension we need to walk in. One thing I would point out here is that the book of Ruth doesn't really concern itself or focus on the conversion experience of Ruth. And that's important for us to recognize, because if we're trying to ask a question of, well, how did Ruth come to trust in Yahweh? That's not really addressed here. Really, all that's addressed is that Ruth does trust in Yahweh. And we pointed to the ambiguity of that earlier phrase of 10 years earlier in chapter 1. And we don't know if Ruth at the very beginning of those 10 years was already a believer of Yahweh who happened to be living in Moab. We don't know if the family converted her early on. We don't know if she converted as Naomi was headed back. We just don't know. Really, what Ruth is more concerned with is not the conversion experience of Ruth, but it's concerned with the righteous behavior that she exhibits, even as somebody who is outside of Israel. Somebody who is willing to cast off her former identity to take on a new identity as a member of the people of God. And so what I want us to recognize is that God's people are the blessed one. In the Old Testament, God's people are those who worship him in the nation of Israel, but also those surrounding the nation of Israel who incorporate themselves into its life. In the New Testament, God's people are the church through Jesus, right? These are God's blessed ones. And what we need to see is that God blesses people always through grace. We never earn entry into being part of God's people. It is always freely given. And yet, once we have been invited to be part of God's people, in a sense, we are owed something. So in this case, Naomi and Ruth are owed something because there's a covenant between God and his people, right? And we talked a little bit about that and thinking back to the story of Abraham, and it's something that we'll continue to flesh out in coming weeks, this idea that God has covenanted, he's pledged himself to these people. If we think about it from our point of view, as Christians, we know that God blesses us in Christ. As I am in Christ, not because I've earned anything, something is owed to me because it's owed to Jesus, and that's the beauty of grace. And so we see all of this playing out in this short little summary statement that Boaz is giving to Ruth and to us as the audience watching in on this story, that he has heard how she has acted honorably. This is the evidence of the fact that even though others, like the foreman, may consider her a foreigner, ultimately she has shown herself to be a member of God's people, a relationship initiated by the grace of God, sustained by the grace of God, but in which God will bless Ruth because she is one of his now. So that was a long way of saying we see that Boaz is comforting Ruth. He's giving her a rationale for why am I blessing you even though you're a foreigner? Because you are now part of the covenant people of God. And Ruth's shock, again, she expresses, I can't believe that I'm being treated as a servant even though I'm not a servant. And this language can be odd for us because for us, we would think, I don't really aspire to be a servant. That doesn't sound like a high position of honor. But in this society, she's thinking, I have no right to work in this country necessarily. I'm at the mercy of somebody who's willing to employ me. So for Boaz to have given me this offer, he's treating me as if I am part of this community. And so in the face of the foreman rejecting her on the fact that she is a Moabitess, Boaz invites her in on the basis of her worship of God. And we see this kind of amplified in this coming mealtime segment. So there's the next few verses follow around mealtime where Ruth is given a position of honor beside Boaz. They share a meal together. Ruth is satisfied. And this ought to make us just think really practically, how long has it been since Ruth had a meal where she left full and had leftovers? It may have been some time. This is a practical kindness that Boaz shows her. And after they have this meal in which Ruth is really given a position of honor and she is given blessing, so we're already starting to see the first fruits of this harvest season that she's experiencing. Boaz has this interaction with his other workers where he makes it really plain. Hey, she can glean wherever she wants to. He gives Ruth permission to really have an upper status among the gleaners. So it says in verse 16, also pull out some from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. Essentially what Boaz is saying is take some of your sheaves that you've already gathered up, throw some of it on the ground so that she has easy pickings coming through. He wants to ensure that she not only is able to subsist here, but she is able to be having enough food and more beside. He wants to ensure that both her and Naomi are cared for. Boaz, he really understands that he does not own his land. God owns his land. And Boaz longs to see God's care directed towards Ruth and Naomi because they are part of his people. And so the text continues. It says, so she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. So what the heck is that? I know you had in your workbook, it asked you to look at a different translation to try to figure out what an ephah is. And I may not even be pronouncing that correctly, but an ephah is 10 omers as a unit. And an omer was the unit used when Israel was wandering in the wilderness, and they would each collect an omer's worth of manna a day to feed themselves. So we can think that an ephah as 10 omers is worth about 10 days worth of food. So this is a tremendous amount of food for Ruth to have gathered in one day. This indicates to us that she was working hard, but also that she was the recipient of blessing, which she indicated that she would need at the beginning of our text, that she was looking for somebody in whose sight she might find favor. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied, meaning from this meal that she shared with Boaz. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So Naomi recognizes this is not normal practice for a gleaner to receive this much food. Naomi's familiar with the traditions and practices of Israel. She knows that gleaners really do live a meager existence. And so it's very obvious that Ruth has come away with this much because a man who owned a field showed kindness to her. And she offers up this prayer for Boaz, not yet knowing that it's Boaz. So text goes on and says, "So she, Ruth, told her mother-in-law Naomi, with whom she had worked, and said, 'The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz.'" If we're tracing our way through the story, this is like the longest possible way we could wrap up to the conclusion of saying his name was Boaz. What the narrator is doing, he's building in us anticipation and expectation of when the heck are we going to hear this guy's name. His name is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." This is a really significant phrase for us. One, it gives us a window into what's going on inside of Naomi. Right? There's a good chance that she has felt forsaken by God. She's lost her husband. She's lost her 2 sons. Yet, in this moment, she says, "The Lord in his kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead," meaning that he is not against us in the way that perhaps I thought he was whenever I was saying, "Call me bitter," at the end of chapter 1. But also this phrase of living or the dead points back to what we talked about at the very beginning, this concept of levirate marriage, that somebody would propagate the name of the dead, that God, through the care of his law, through the provision of his people, through this relative structure, they would ensure that an heir descends even when there's a husband deceased. And so this is another hint that something bigger is at work for us here. And Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And so Naomi is saying, wow, this is incredible, not only because we've received this blessing of food, but because the man who blessed us with this food, he's a relative, which means that he may have some sense of legal obligation towards us as his kin, but also, again, because it's not just there's legal obligation, because in the days of the judges, who knows who's obeying the law? It's legal obligation mixed with the evidence that this is a worthy man. He's a man that has looked to show blessing on Ruth in her impoverished and vulnerable estate. And so these two things together are a good sign for there being a light at the end of the tunnel of Ruth and Naomi's dark and desperate situation. And so the text finally wraps up here. It says, "And Ruth the Moabite said, 'Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" So this is an invitation for the whole of harvest season. "And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with these young women, lest in another field you be assaulted.' So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law." The barley and wheat harvest here, this gives us another fast forward picture. So not nearly as much of a fast forward as the 10 years we had earlier, but it's likely the barley and wheat harvests are over an April-May time frame. So at least a couple of months in which Ruth is in close proximity to Boaz and his household. And really, I wonder if you saw as we were doing this chapter, this is very much done in that same mirror style. We see another inclusio here. And so if you were to trace the scenes all the way through, what we see is the beginning is kind of this conversation between Ruth and Naomi, and the end is, and there's kind of a narrative summary talking about how Ruth went out and Ruth comes back. And there are on and on and on until we get to the center portion of the story, which is around Boaz's pronouncement of why he's offering grace. And that's because Ruth is one of the people of God. And see, we see here the text closes by saying she, Ruth, lived with her mother-in-law. So there's still this element of all this hope has been introduced, but at this moment in the story, Ruth is clinging to Naomi. And we, as the audience, are left wondering, when will she cling to somebody else? Perhaps when will she cling to Boaz? And so the thing I want to leave you guys with is this story is really showing us these incremental actions of Ruth and Naomi being drawn further and further into the grace and mercy of God. God, we objectively know, we know with our minds that He is a provider. He's in charge of all things. He's the one who makes the rain fall and the crops grow, right? But the experience of these women has not always backed that up. They have been wondering, where is God in the midst of this? And what's incredible is in the midst of their wondering, they don't reject God. They don't shake their fist at God. They turn back to Bethlehem and they go. For Naomi, she returns to her home. For Ruth, she seeks out a new home. And here, Yahweh, through Boaz, is providing for these women who seek His protection. And so what I want to challenge you guys with is to think about, where can you imitate these women in terms of, if there are places where there is a discrepancy between what you know to be true of God, but what you feel like you're experiencing, where can you turn towards Him rather than running from Him? And likewise, where are you in a position to be Boaz to somebody else? Someone who lives by the law of God in a way that is exemplary, that goes beyond what is expected. Is it a place in your work where you can bless an employee or a coworker? Is it a place in your neighborhood where you can show kindness to somebody who, on a worldly standard, does not deserve it? Is it a dynamic in your home with the way you love your wife or your children? So as we go into reflection right now, I want you to be thinking about those things. Thanks, guys, and we'll catch you next week.